Good morning, everyone. It is a big week for seed starting here for me in Ohio. And that is because mid-February is the time when I start a big chunk of my cool season veggies indoors, including one of my all-time favorite vegetable families, the brassicas. This mid-February start date is going to include most of those brassicas or cruciferous crops, including things like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale, collards, and kohlrabi. Now, an exception to that is my Brussels sprouts, which I do start later, typically anywhere from the end of March till the end of April, and a few things like turnips and radishes, which I will direct sow in about a month in the garden. With my leafy brassicas like kale and collards, I will start those indoors now. I will also do a succession sowing later, direct sowing those into the garden. But with my heading brassicas, so think in particular broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage, I have found that this mid-February start date indoors is the date that works the absolute best for me. And that is because it allows me to get a jump on the growing season, and I'm able to harvest heads usually by the end of June before the really intense heat of the summer sets in. So today I'm going to walk you through the process I use to start my brassicas indoors, as well as a few general tips for seed starting that work for all vegetable crops. So let's talk supplies. I've got a pretty basic setup here. Most important are my trays, my seed starting medium, and my labels. For my brassicas and most of my crops, I tend to use these 50 cell trays. And this is just because this is what I have on hand. I had a lot of these given to me as hand-me-downs and they work really well. I'm certainly not saying this is what everyone should use, but it works well for me. But a couple of notes on these specific trays. When I use these, I am careful to plant crop types that are the same or similar within a single tray. I do this to avoid having one type of seedling in a tray that's very, very quick growing, vigorous, gets big really quickly, shading out another type of seedling that might be smaller and less vigorous. So for example, I probably wouldn't put something like spinach that's going to be a little bit slower to germinate, a little bit slower to put on a lot of growth, right next to something like a Chinese cabbage, which are typically very, very quick to germinate and get large quite quickly because they're going to shade out and compete against the spinach. It's not going to end well for the spinach. Now I do this because I do not upgrade from these trays. If I can avoid upgrading vegetables into a larger pot, I absolutely will. A few exceptions to that are my tomatoes, which outgrow my trays every single year. But for all of my early season crops, brassicas included, they will stay in these 50 cell trays until they are ready to be transplanted out in the garden. And I find that this gives me a really nice, healthy sized seedling ready for transplant. Now, if you've watched any of my prior seed starting videos, you have probably heard me harp on seed starting medium before. But I'm going to talk about it again because I feel like one of the best ways that you can set yourself up for success in seed starting is to start with a good quality seed starting mix. Now, whether that is mixing up your own, like I show in this video, or just sticking with a really high quality seed starting mix from your garden center. What you ultimately want to look for is something that is light and fluffy and really well draining. Now, if I'm in a big hurry and I don't have the time or the ingredients to mix my own, I tend to stick with Pro Mix's Ultimate Organic Soil. It's not technically labeled as a seed starting mix, but I've had really good results starting all of my seeds in it. I've had quite a few questions about sterilizing potting mixes or seed starting mixes, and I don't personally. You can certainly sterilize if fungus gnats and other things like that are a concern of yours. I have only ever had one issue with fungus gnats, and it was actually last year after I stupidly brought home a brand of mix that I don't normally use because my Pro Mix wasn't available and I didn't have my ingredients to mix my own. And I got a terrible infestation of fungus gnats in my seedlings as well as in my house plants. But I was able to pretty easily clear that up by using a product from Gardens Alive called Knockout Gnats. It's a biological larvicide. So basically it's something that gets in there and essentially eats the fungus gnat larva. Does not kill the adults. So I also used some of those yellow sticky traps to help trap and kill those adult fungus gnats. But after I got that cleared up, I've never had any more issues. One note, if you do decide to sterilize and you're wanting to use mycorrhizae in your seed starting mix, just be sure to add that after the sterilization process, or you will render that mycorrhizae useless. Now to get started, I find it easiest just to dump all of my seed starting medium in a large tote like this. That way I can just drop my trays into here and fill them and keep the mess somewhat contained. After filling up my trays, I thoroughly saturate the soil and then let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes to drain off. Now, in the warmer months, I just fill up all my trays, hit them with the garden hose. I'm kind of stuck with using my kitchen sink right now, which is not ideal, but it gets the job done. Now to sow these, I make a small divot in the top of my seed starting mix. I'm just using the end of a Sharpie. They have little special dibbler tools out there that you can use. This works really well for me. And you don't want to plant these too deep. I'm only going about 1/4 of an inch, if that, in depth. I drop my seeds in here. Usually with brassicas, I aim for 2 seeds per cell. Lightly cover those with soil, and then give that another misting with water. Next, I'm going to put on my humidity domes, and these guys are ready to go under the grow lights. Now, I always use humidity domes to hasten germination. You can do the same thing with clear plastic wrap if you don't have lids for your trays. But I do want to point out that I remove these domes as soon as the majority of seedlings have emerged. I don't leave the domes on waiting for everything in a tray to pop up, because that can actually be detrimental to your seedlings that are up. And typically, if that seed is good, those will come up eventually, whether or not you have the domes on them. Now that's just another reason to keep similar types in the same tray, because if you're planting all of your broccolis together, or something like broccoli and cauliflower together, you're going to have very similar germination rates, meaning all of those seedlings are going to pretty much pop up at the same time. For cool season crops, I do not use a heat mat. I find it completely unnecessary, and in fact, I feel like it may be babying them a little bit too much. I save the heat mats for my heat lovers, so things like tomatoes, peppers, and melons. Now, brassicas in general do germinate quite quickly, so I expect most of these to be up within about a week, and that's at around 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Germination times will vary a little bit depending on how warm or cool your environment is. As my seedlings germinate and grow, I like to keep my grow lights just inches above the tops of the seedlings. Now, this is with T8 fluorescent lights. If you are using something like an LED full spectrum light, the height at which you keep your lights might vary, but in general, with something like a T8 or T12 fluorescent light, keeping those lights just inches from the tops of your seedlings will help prevent stretching. Now, I have had a lot of folks ask me what they should do if they want to start seeds indoors and don't have grow lights, and I'm running a couple of experiments right now. So stay tuned, because in the next video, I'm going to share some techniques that you can use to get seeds started early without necessarily using grow lights. Now, once my seedlings are up, I do thin them. And that's another topic I get a fair amount of questions on, is in regards to thinning or separating seedlings. As I mentioned, I generally try to plant 2 seeds per cell. Once in a while, I'll do more than that if I know that my germination rate is a little low on the seed, or if it's old seed. And the reason that I do this is just to ensure that I end up with 1 healthy seedling per cell in my tray. That way I am not wasting tray space. Once my seedlings are up and a couple of inches tall, I will snip off the smaller, shorter seedling and allow the larger seedling to remain. I do not try to separate seedlings and repot them. And this is because A, I find it horrifyingly tedious and I don't have the patience to do that. And B, probably more importantly, I don't find that I have great success doing that. So with many vegetables, those seedlings are very, very tender. In the past, when I've tried to go in and separate them out from a 50 cell like that, they just really end up being stressed and often don't make it. And I didn't find that it was an exercise that was worth my time or effort. A strong exception to that being onions. They are incredibly resilient, and you can stuff them all in a tray and separate all those little tiny delicate suckers out, and almost every single one of them will make it. But I generally shy away from trying to separate any of my other seedlings. I will say, if separating your seedlings out is something that you want to do so that you're not wasting seeds or plants, just be very, very careful and really baby those little seedlings after you do the separation. So really make sure that they're getting, really getting some nice watering, getting some good food so that they can get reestablished and kind of get over that shock. Once my brassica seedlings are up an inch or two and have their first set of true leaves, I start feeding them. And to do this, I just use a natural liquid fertilizer that I mix in with the water each time that I water my seedlings. Unfortunately, the one that I use all the time is out of stock right now. It's Next Step seedling fertilizer from Gardens Alive. But in general, what I look for in a seedling fertilizer specifically is something that is a little bit lower in nitrogen and a little bit higher in phosphorus. And this is because phosphorus helps plants deal with stress and put on a strong root system, something that you definitely want to provide for your young little seedlings when they're first getting established. The other thing I will mention is that the fertilizer I'm using is very, very low ratios of NPK. As a general recommendation, I'd stay away from anything with super high levels and definitely anything synthetic. Miracle-Gro, because those synthetic fertilizers tend to allow your plants to put on a really nice but artificial growth surge. They'll look really, really beautiful for a short time, but ultimately I feel as though you end up with a less resilient, structurally weaker plant in the long run. And as I've mentioned in other videos, I keep a fan on these seedlings once they're up an inch or two, generally for a couple hours a day, at least a couple times a week. And that's just going to help, again, with the resilience. It gives them stronger stems, it gets them used to air movement that they'll naturally encounter outdoors, and it helps prevent damping off. And finally, when my seedlings are around 4 to 6 inches tall, with 2 to 4 nice sets of true leaves and thick stalky stems, I am ready to bring these outdoors. Now, generally from a mid-February sowing, I will be bringing these outdoors to start hardening off towards the end of March. Now, I am fortunate enough to have a small greenhouse, so in particular with these early season crops, I will bring them out and put them in that greenhouse with the window and the door open, depending on how cold it is, for about a week or so, and that generally seems to be enough to allow them to harden off. If you don't have a greenhouse, it's totally fine. Just set your trays in a protected spot, so like the corner of your house or patio is a really nice area, just somewhere where they're going to be a little bit protected from wind and curious critters. And all you want to do is just increase their exposure to sunlight over the course of about a week. Do not put them out on a brilliantly sunny, warm spring day for the first time. Forget about them and leave them out there for 12 hours because they will fry. I know from experience, but generally setting them out for a couple hours, especially on an overcast day, and then maybe 4 hours the next day, 5 hours the next day, so on and so forth. You don't have to get super particular with this. You're just wanting to gradually increase that exposure so they get used to sunlight and they get used to wind. I also generally cover my transplants after I've planted them. So I use something like an insect netting cover or a frost cloth cover, putting those over top of my seedlings pretty much as soon as I get them planted out and watered well. And this helps with a couple of different issues. First of all, if for some reason they didn't get fully hardened off during that week-long or so process, this really helps slowly and easily transition them into their new garden environment. Second, it keeps them protected from any hungry pests or critters. Bunnies in particular love tasty, tender, young brassica seedlings. So these covers help keep the pests off. And if you're growing in an area that is anything like my garden here in Ohio, you can go from 70 degrees and sunny to snowing in a matter of 2 days in April, which can be really stressful on tender young seedlings. So those row covers just kind of help to protect from any freakish weather snaps like that. Because while brassicas, as a rule, are quite cold hardy, they do need some time to get established in that new garden environment before they can really be exposed to those super low temperatures. So I find that using things like frost cloth really help them easily transition. And again, give me that jump start on the season that helps me have a successful crop. So I've got a lot of seeds to sow today, so I'm going to get to it. But if you'd like more specifics on growing cool weather crops or seed starting in general, be sure to check out my cool season gardening and seed starting playlist. And as always, if you found today's video helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. I appreciate everyone's support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.